Welcome, folks. It's another episode of the Patriot Network. It's the 3rd of February, and we want to talk today about President Obama's new budget proposal that he's sending down to the Congress of the United States. But first, I want to give you our quote to start the day with, and this is from Samuel Langhorne Clemens, better known to most of us as Mark Twain. He remarked, "The government is merely a servant, merely a temporary servant. It cannot be its prerogative, the government's prerogative, to determine what is right and what is wrong, and to decide who is a patriot and who isn't. The function of government is to obey orders, our orders, not originate them." Food for thought as we talk today about the new budget proposed by the President. The President's proposed budget is for $3.8 trillion. And the deficit that goes with that is $1.6 trillion, meaning that he wants the federal government to spend, or the projection for spending for the fiscal year that they're doing this budget for, is $5.4 trillion. Now, I want to put that in context. A trillion is 1,000 billion. A billion is 1,000 million. But let's think about the history of the United States. From 1776 till 1980, the entire federal debt of the United States totaled, 1776 up until 1980, our total federal debt totaled $800 billion. President Carter, and I mentioned this in talking about the State of the Union address, President Carter, with a $2 trillion GDP, had a $60 billion deficit, and that really, more than anything else, his failure to be able to deal with the economy, and by the way, it isn't that he deliberately misunderstood or couldn't grasp. A very bright guy, nuclear engineer, graduated from Annapolis, was, captain on a sub, hooray for Jimmy, he's a good guy. But he never grasped the overall macro implication of telling the American people that they were just consumers and not producers. And when he gave the Great Malaise speech, when he said, you're just going to have to expect less, you're going to have to turn down the thermometer, and really what he said was you're going to have to turn down the level of dream that you have about what you'll accomplish in your life. That was a huge mistake. His pollster, Pat Caddell, who is around today, if you watch the talking head cable news shows, you can still see Pat Caddell around. Pat Caddell was his head pollster and one of his closest advisors. And he had the unenviable job of coming in and sitting down with Jimmy and Rosalynn and explaining to him that they weren't going to beat Ronald Reagan. And Rosalynn was so personally just flabbergasted, so personally morally offended, because she thought Ronald Reagan was just this absolute, beyond the pale, insane person. She could not understand how the American people could vote against her husband and vote for Ronald Reagan. But the key to this is understanding the size of the budget, the size of the deficit, and the size of the federal debt. This is a very objective analysis that you can get a handle on and understand what's going on. And what I want to do today is make clear to you how extreme, how fundamentally, radically extreme the proposal of President Obama is in terms of total spending. $3.8 trillion for spending that we're going to put in terms of the budget, and then a budget deficit of $1.6 trillion for a total amount of federal spending in a single year of $5.4 trillion. From the founding of the country up until 1980, the total debt we'd amassed is $800 billion. Now, it's important to put in perspective, the TARP plan was $787 billion. Okay? The stimulus plan that the President put out, $780-some billion. Those were amounts, each of those programs in and of themselves were amounts equal to the entire debt we'd amassed from 1776 until 1980. President Carter loses to then Governor Reagan because, as Pat Caddell sits him down and tells him, you've got a $2 trillion economy and a $60 billion budget deficit, and there's nothing we can do. The deficit is basically structural. If Carter would have cut his entire cabinet, eliminated the cabinet posts and got rid of those functions, Department of Labor, Interior, Agriculture, all of it, it still wouldn't have balanced the budget way back then. Today, if we look at what has been proposed, we're talking about a budget deficit that is greater, 2 times greater. Our deficit is 2 times greater than the entire debt that we had acquired between the birth of the country in 1980. So in the last 30 years, from 1980 till 2010, we have run the debt, the U.S. federal debt, and the debt is nothing but the sum of all the deficits. The deficit is the yearly imbalance we have between revenue and spending, and the debt is the sum of all those. And it's important to remember that when we do the federal budget and we pay interest on the debt, we haven't amortized it. It's not like a mortgage. It's not like your mortgage where you've got a 15-year or 30-year mortgage and you're going to pay it off and you pay principal and interest every month. We pay interest only. If we pay the $600 billion interest on the debt from now until 10,000 years from now, we still owe all the debt, and that's if we balance every budget. If we don't balance the budgets, we add to the debt every year and increase the size of the interest on the debt we have to pay. So, 1980, $2 trillion economy, $60 billion deficit. President Reagan, 8 years in office, $6 trillion economy when he leaves with a $180 billion deficit. Now, what happens is those deficits add up. And we end up, by the time that we get to today, February 3rd, 2010, our federal debt is approaching $13 trillion. The Congress is attempting to move the debt ceiling up by $1.9 trillion to 14.9, almost 15 trillion bucks. Now put that in perspective. The GDP of the United States this year should be roughly 15 trillion bucks. So in other words, we're going to owe in our federal debt the equivalent of what we make, the total sum of goods and services produced in a year inside the United States, netting out import and export. And what I want you to really think about for a second, we're going to do really 2, we'll do 2 on the budget proposal of the President today, but what I want to, we're almost out of time in this first one, so I want to leave you with this. We're heading toward a federal debt, the sum of all the deficits, of 15 trillion. On a yearly basis, the total economic activity of the United States is approaching 15 trillion, maybe 16 trillion, depending on how you want to count it. If we have more debt than we have economic activity, we're in the business of going bankrupt. And what do we do as the debt goes from 15 trillion to 30 trillion, which is the promise of the Obama administration? Over the next 10 years, they will double the debt from 15 trillion to 30 trillion. When we have a $30 trillion debt and our yearly interest on the debt payment goes to $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion, what do we do? What happens at the point when the Chinese, the Japanese, the British, the Americans don't want to buy treasury bills from the United States because they're $30 trillion in debt and there's no likelihood they can ever pay it off? The essential problem with the current budget, and we'll go through in the next episode, I'll talk about some of the specifics, but the real problem is the strategic problem of doubling the debt over the next decade. We cannot sustain levels of debt of this size. And even the Democrats, Senator Byron Dorgan from the Dakotas yesterday got up and said this budget is impractical, it's unsustainable, it will bankrupt our country. So where I want to leave you at the end of this episode is a $3.8 trillion budget plus a $1.6 trillion deficit means $5.4 trillion of spending, and that's not counting off budget items, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. So it's time to exercise some restraint. So what we're going to do is come back in the next episode and go into a little more depth on the budget, but I want you to get that we cannot politically, socially, realistically push this budget forward. This budget is delusional.